Hello everyone, and welcome to the lecture on Basic Introduction to Python. In this lecture, we'll look at some of the basic syntaxes in Python language. We'll learn about variables, functions, and so many other object types in Python. And here are some of the data types in Python: strings, lists, dictionaries, and tuples. So all of this data types, variables, functions, and objects, they need to follow certain naming conventions. So we store the value of certain data types in variables or other objects, and they follow naming conventions. So for this naming conventions, our variables can start with letters. So letters, it can be upper or lowercase, or they can start with underscore. So those are the rules. The name for our variables can start with letters, upper or lowercase, or an underscore. And they can be followed by numbers or letters. Okay? For example, let's say we have this number 5. And if I want to store this number 5 in a certain variable, let's say x, I can say x is equal to 5. So this will be my variable. The variable is x, the variable name. So the variable name can start with letters, which is upper or lowercase, or it can start with an underscore. So we look at 3 examples. Let's say x is equal to 5. So this is lower x. Then we can say upper x is equal to 7, for instance. And let's say underscore x is equal to 8. So these are appropriate naming conventions. Python is case sensitive, so upper x and lower x are different, since Python is a case sensitive language. So let's run our cells. To run a cell, hit Shift plus Enter on your keyboard. That will run a cell. So let's run the cell. X is equal to 5. Now let's run the cell. Upper x is equal to 7. And the third cell. Now if we call our variable x, which is lower x, 5 will be printed. So the value of our variable x is 5. Whereas if we call our upper x, the value 7 will be printed. And if we call our variable underscore x, we get 8. So those are appropriate or valid names for our variables. And as I mentioned, these letters can be followed by one or more numbers or even letters. For instance, I can say, let's say, my number, let's say 45. So if we run this, this is appropriate. And if I call my variable my number, so that's the variable name, my number, 45 will be printed. My number, run the cell, 45 is printed. And we cannot use punctuation characteristics like %sign or $sign for naming. So if we use this, we'll get an error. Let me show you an example. So I cannot say %x is equal to 22. If I run this, I get an error. So variable names cannot start with percentage or $sign. cannot say, let's say $3 $x is equal to, let's say 4. So syntax error, invalid syntax. Then you have the $sign. So our variable names cannot start with punctuation names, with punctuation marks or characters, like %sign or $sign. And as I mentioned, Python is case sensitive. For instance, if I say my number is equal to 7, is different from my number is equal to 9. So in this case, if I call my variable my name, I get 7, whereas if I call my variable uppercase my name, I get 9. And variable names can not start with what is known as keywords. These are reserved words in Python, reserved words. So our variable names cannot start with keywords. So for a list of keywords, I have a link here. It just shows the keywords. These are some of the keywords: and, as, assert, break, class, continue, def, while, print, raise, and so on. So we cannot use any of these keywords for our name, for our variable name. For instance, if is one keyword, we cannot store, let's say, our number 5 in a variable called if, because if is a keyword. If we run this, we get an error. Okay, since if is a keyword. Another keyword is the statement except. If I say except is equal to 8, I'll get an error. That's because except is a keyword. So that's important to remember. Next, let's talk about lines and indentation. Lines and indentation are very important in Python, and that's how Python keeps track of the code that we write. Let me show you an example. For instance, let's say print x is 5, and if we run this, x is 5 is printed. Now let me show you a simple if statement. We can say if. Before that, let's define a character. Let's define a number and save it in a variable. Let's say I is equal to 8. So if I call I, 8 will be printed. The value of I is 8. Now let's use an if statement. We can say if I double equal to, let's say, 9, print the value of I is 9. Notice here the indentation. So before I wrote this, so if I remove that, so if I double equal to 9 colon, and then when I hit enter, you see it automatically indents for us, because that's how it keeps track of all the codes. So indentation is important. Let me paste it, and then if I hit enter again, so it indents. We can go back and let's have another statement, else, and then when we hit enter, it auto indents for us automatically, because that's how it keeps track of all our code. Else print, let's say, the value of I is not 9. So if we run this statement, if we run this code, this print statement will be printed. Since I is not equal to 8, the else statement will be printed and we'll get the value of I is not 9. So we get the value of I is not 9. Now, so it keeps track of all this code due to this indentation. So Python knows that this statement, this print statement, is under the if condition here, whereas this print statement is under the else condition here. So instead of this, let's say if we don't indent this and try to print this, we'll get an error. So if we run this, it says indentation error. Okay, because after this else statement, Python expects an indentation, but it's missing an indentation. So we get that error. Similarly, under the if condition, if I don't indent, I'll get the same indentation error. It says indentation error, expected an indented block. Then it shows you where an indentation is expected. So it's expecting an indentation here. So we'll learn more about indentation when we go through the lecture, but this is just a brief introduction that indentation is very important in Python, and that's how it keeps track of all the codes. Great. In the next lecture, we'll continue our introduction on basic Python. Thank you, everyone.